The old historian's hand shook as he accessed the archived records. Around him, the great library of the Galactic Council stood silent and dark, its vast halls empty at this late hour. He had special permission to study these classified files, the ones that documented humanity's first major interstellar conflict. Most young species asked about it eventually. They would see humans in their massive ships, notice how other races gave them respect in space, and wonder what had happened. The historian's job was to explain, to warn, to make sure no one ever repeated those mistakes. The record started simple enough. The Shadows, as they were known throughout the galaxy, had found Earth in their usual way, searching for species they could manipulate and control. They were experts at psychological warfare, having conquered 12 other civilizations through fear and mental torture. The first reports from their scouts seemed promising to them. Humans showed all the right weaknesses. They felt emotions strongly, formed deep bonds with each other, and cared deeply about their young. The Shadows saw these traits as perfect vulnerabilities to exploit. Target species shows extreme emotional responses. One Shadow commander had written, "They weep at fiction. They mourn animals that aren't even their own species. They form attachments to simple machines. Conquest should be straightforward." The historian paused the recording, remembering how wrong they had been. What the Shadows saw as weaknesses were actually humanity's greatest strengths. But no one had realized that then. The Shadows' first attacks were subtle. They began broadcasting low-frequency waves that caused anxiety and depression in humans. They expected the species to fragment, for their societies to break down as people became too mentally exhausted to maintain their bonds. Instead, something unexpected happened. Humans began checking on each other more. They formed support groups. They developed new ways to stay connected. When someone was down, others lifted them up. The Shadows increased the strength of their attacks, but humans only pulled together more tightly. Unexpected resistance. Another report noted, target species appears to be adapting. Recommend increasing pressure. That was when the Shadows made their first major mistake. They attacked Earth's communication systems, trying to isolate communities from each other. They thought this would finally break the human spirit, but they didn't understand that humans had lived through isolation before. They had survived plagues, wars, and disasters. They knew how to rebuild, how to find each other, how to stay strong. The historian pulled up the images from that time. Pictures showed humans creating new communities, helping strangers, sharing resources. Where the Shadows expected to see chaos, they instead found organization. Where they looked for weakness, they found strength. But the Shadows weren't done. They had their reputation to maintain. They were the masters of fear, the breakers of civilizations. They couldn't let one primitive species resist them. So they prepared their master stroke, a plan that had broken even the strongest species they'd encountered before. The historian's hands trembled as he accessed the final report from that early period. The Shadows had decided to target human children. Species shows extreme protective instincts toward young. The last Shadow commander wrote, "Targeting offspring will ensure complete psychological breakdown." The historian closed the file. He didn't need to read further. Everyone in the galaxy knew what happened next. The Shadows had thought they were about to break humanity. Instead, they had awakened something terrible. In targeting children, the Shadows had crossed a line that united every human on Earth. They had triggered something primal, something unstoppable. They had turned a species known for its capacity to love into one focused entirely on revenge. The historian looked at the timestamp on the final report. Within 3 days of that decision, humanity had developed their first countermeasures. Within a week, they had launched their first attacks. Within a month, the Shadows had begun to understand their terrible mistake. But by then, it was far too late. The historian pulled up the next set of records, the ones that showed exactly how the Shadows had sealed their fate. These were the hardest files to watch, but they were also the most important. They showed the moment when humanity stopped being victims and became something else entirely. The shadows had started projecting horrific images directly into human minds. They expected panic, chaos, and surrender. Their vessels orbited Earth, broadcasting terror into every human brain they could reach. They showed people their worst fears, their deepest nightmares, over and over again. But humans did something the shadows had never seen before. They adapted. When the images came, humans learned to hold hands. They discovered that physical contact helped block the worst of the visions. Soon, entire communities were sleeping in large groups, protecting each other from the mental attacks. Dr. Marcus worked in his lab during those dark days, studying the patterns of headaches that came with the shadow attacks. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, but he kept working. The shadows had taken his daughter's smile away, and he wanted it back. The frequency, he told his colleagues, pointing at his readings. There's a pattern to it. They're not just broadcasting randomly. They're using specific wavelengths to target different parts of the brain. The shadows noticed this discovery too late. They had grown overconfident after centuries of easy victories. They didn't realize that humans had already learned so much about their methods. They didn't know that for every person they broke, 10 more became stronger, more determined to fight back. Then came the day that changed everything. The shadows launched what they called their master stroke. They gathered their strongest psychics and aimed them at Earth's schools. They wanted to break the children first, thinking this would finally shatter human resistance. The historian paused the recording, remembering the stories he'd heard about that day. The screams of children echoed across every continent. Parents watched helplessly as their little ones clutched their heads in agony. Teachers tried desperately to comfort their students as wave after wave of terror washed over them. But the shadows had made a terrible mistake. They didn't understand what humans were capable of when their children were threatened. Dr. Marcus's instruments recorded everything that day. His machines captured the exact frequencies the shadows used, and in his rage and desperation, he found something the shadows had thought impossible, a way to block their attacks completely. The signal isn't just one way, he wrote in his notes. They're not just broadcasting. They're receiving feedback, using it to adjust their attacks. If we can disrupt that feedback loop, within hours, the first prototype shields were ready. They weren't perfect, but they worked well enough to protect the children. Within days, factories across the planet had switched to producing these devices. Humans didn't care about profits anymore. They just wanted to keep their children safe. The shadows watched in confusion as their attacks became less and less effective. They increased the power of their broadcasts, but it didn't matter. Humanity had found their weakness, and now they were ready to strike back. The historian looked at the final report from this period. It was short, just a few lines from a shadow commander to their high command. Something is wrong. The humans aren't breaking. They're getting stronger, and they're looking at us now. Not with fear, with rage. That was the moment when the shadows should have run. They should have fled as far and as fast as they could. But their pride wouldn't let them. They had never failed before. They couldn't imagine failing now. The historian closed the file. The next records would show the beginning of humanity's revenge, and even after all these years, those images were still hard to watch. The galaxy had never seen anything like what happened next, and if they were lucky, they never would again. The historian activated the holographic display, showing the moment when everything changed. The images flickered to life, showing hundreds of military leaders from Earth meeting in an underground bunker. For the first time in human history, every nation had sent representatives. There were no fights about who would lead, no arguments about old rivalries. They had only one goal: to make the shadows pay. Dr. Marcus and Professor Ann stood before them, explaining their discovery. The room was silent as they showed how the shadows' mental attacks worked. They had found not just how to block the attacks, but how to trace them back to their source. Their greatest weapon is their greatest weakness, Professor Ann explained, pointing to her diagrams. Every time they attack our minds, they leave a trail we can follow, like footprints in the snow. The military leaders leaned forward, their eyes sharp with interest. They had spent months watching their people suffer, unable to fight back. Now they had a way to find the enemy, a way to strike back. But they weren't the only ones watching Earth. Other alien species had noticed what was happening. The Galactic Council, which had ignored Earth until now, suddenly paid very close attention. The eldest species among them remembered old stories, warnings about what happened when peaceful races were pushed too far. "We should stop this," one council member suggested. "The humans don't know what they're about to become." "It's too late," another replied. The shadows crossed the line. We all know what happens next. Some alien species, those who had watched the shadows destroy other civilizations, secretly reached out to Earth. They offered help, not out of kindness, but out of fear. They had seen the change in humans' eyes. They knew what that look meant. On Earth, factories that once made cars now produced warships. Scientists who had worked on medical cures now developed weapons. Every human had a single purpose: to make sure no one would ever hurt their children again. Professor Ann developed something new, a way to turn the shadows' mental attacks back on them. "They've been in our heads," she told the military council. "Let's show them what's in ours. Let's show them what they've created." The historian paused the recording, remembering the reports from that time. The shadows had never faced anything like this before. They had broken 12 other species, but those species had fought alone. Humans were different. They worked together, shared everything they learned, and moved as one. The first human ships launched quietly, using the Shadow's own technology against them. These ships carried no traditional weapons. They didn't need them. Instead, they broadcast human thoughts, human memories, human rage. The Shadows discovered too late that the fear they had tried to create now had a new target: themselves. Other alien species watched in amazement as human ships appeared near their worlds, not to conquer, but to free those the Shadows had enslaved. The humans didn't ask for payment or demand allegiance. They simply broke the Shadows' control and moved on, hunting for their real prey. The Shadows began to realize their mistake. They sent messages to Earth, offering to leave, offering to surrender. But they had made their choices. They had hurt human children. There would be no forgiveness. The historian looked at the final reports from this period. Humanity had transformed from a single-planet species into an interstellar force in less than a year. They had taken everything the Shadows knew about fear and turned it into a weapon. The galaxy watched in silence as humanity began their hunt. The Shadows had wanted to teach humans about fear. Now, the humans would teach them instead. The historian opened the military records from Operation Lighthouse, humanity's first major offensive against the Shadows. These files showed how a species that had never left its solar system became the most feared force in the galaxy within months. Commander Jack stood on the bridge of Earth's first battleship, the Retribution. The ship's hull was covered in devices designed by Dr. Marcus, each one turning the Shadows' mental attacks back at them. The crew worked silently, their faces lit by the glow of their screens. They had all lost someone to the Shadows' attacks. They all wanted justice. The first Shadow outpost fell in less than an hour. The Shadows had expected their usual tactics to work, filling the human minds with terror and despair. Instead, their own warriors collapsed, overwhelmed by the memories of human children screaming in pain. The Shadows learned too late that human anger was far more terrifying than any nightmare they could create. "They're running," one of the crew reported, watching the Shadow ships flee. "Should we pursue?" Commander Jack didn't hesitate. Yes, they wanted to see what humanity was capable of. "Let's show them." The Retribution wasn't alone. Hundreds of human ships spread across the galaxy, each one hunting Shadow bases. They found their targets easily. Every Shadow attack had left a trail, like a map leading straight to them. The humans followed these trails, one by one, erasing the Shadow presence from every world they found. Other alien species watched in shock. They had known humans were dangerous. All life forms that survived on predator worlds were. But this was different. The humans weren't just fighting. They were systematically dismantling an empire that had existed for thousands of years. The Shadows tried new tactics. They attempted to hide their bases underground. They tried to blend in with other species. They even tried to build physical weapons, abandoning their mental attacks entirely. Nothing worked. The humans had learned too well, had adapted too quickly. Please, the Shadow Leaders sent messages to Earth. We surrender. We will leave your worlds alone. We will never harm another child. The historian paused the recording, remembering what happened next. The humans had received these messages, had read them carefully. Then they had sent back a single response. You had your chance. Commander Jack led his fleet into the heart of shadow space. The Shadows had hidden their homeworld for centuries, keeping it safe from those they tormented. But they hadn't counted on human determination. Every shadow attack had left a trace, and humans had followed every trace, every clue, every tiny hint until they found it. The shadow homeworld was beautiful, covered in tall spires that reached into the clouds. The Shadows believed their planet was safe, protected by the most powerful mental weapons they had ever created. They watched human ships appear in their skies and prepared their strongest attacks. But something was wrong. Their weapons didn't work. Worse, they began to feel something new. The combined weight of human emotion, the collected pain of every person they had ever tortured, flowing back into their minds. The historian looked at the casualty reports from that day. The Shadows had lost more ships in that single battle than in all their previous wars combined, not because of physical weapons, but because they finally understood what they had awakened. The last transmission from the Shadow homeworld was short. What are you? Commander Jack's response was equally brief. We are what you made us. We are humanity's rage, and we are not finished yet. The historian closed the file. The next records would show the fall of the Shadow civilization, but those images were almost too painful to watch. The galaxy had learned an important lesson. Humans would forgive many things, but harming their children was not one of them. The historian accessed the files marked The Hunt, his fingers trembling slightly as he entered the security codes. These records showed the darkest period of the conflict, when humanity turned their full attention to eliminating every trace of the Shadow species from the galaxy. Admiral Thomas stood before the United Earth Council, presenting maps of known Shadow territories. Red dots marked confirmed Shadow locations, while blue dots showed suspected hiding places. Every day, more red dots turned black as human fleets wiped out another Shadow stronghold. They're hiding among other species now, the Admiral reported, pretending to be refugees, begging for protection. His voice was calm, but his eyes were hard. It won't help them. The other species in the galaxy watched in silent horror as humans systematically tracked down every Shadow group, no matter how well hidden. Some alien races had tried to shelter Shadow refugees, thinking humans would show mercy. They learned quickly that humanity's kindness had limits. We're not monsters, Admiral Thomas told an alien council that had hidden Shadow survivors. Hand them over, and we'll leave your world in peace. Protect them, and we'll consider you just as guilty. The alien council took less than an hour to decide. They had seen what happened to Shadow worlds. They had watched human ships turn entire space stations into floating tombs, not through violence, but by broadcasting the collected pain of every child the Shadows had tortured. No one wanted to face that kind of justice. In their desperation, the remaining Shadows tried to blend in with peaceful species, altering their appearances and abandoning their mental powers completely. But they couldn't hide the traces their powers had left in their brains. Human scanners found these marks easily, and human ships followed. Please, the last Shadow leaders begged. We've changed. We'll never hurt anyone again. We've learned our lesson. The historian paused the recording, knowing what came next. The humans had received many such pleas. They had considered none of them. The Shadows had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They had hurt children, and in doing so, they had forfeited any right to mercy. One Shadow group tried to fight back, gathering their strongest warriors for a final stand. They thought they could overwhelm human ships with sheer numbers. They didn't understand that humanity had spent months studying their tactics, their weaknesses, their fears. The battle lasted less than a day. Human ships surrounded the Shadow Fleet, their hulls gleaming in the starlight. They didn't fire a single shot. They didn't need to. Instead, they broadcast something new. The combined hope of every child they had saved, the joy of every family reunited, the strength of human love turned into a weapon. The shadow ships fell silent, their crews unable to handle emotions they had never understood. Their own weapons had made them vulnerable to feelings this strong. They had spent so long spreading fear that they had forgotten about other human emotions, ones far more powerful. Admiral Thomas watched the last shadow ships drift powerless in space. His voice was quiet as he gave the final order. Send them what they gave our children. Let them experience true fear. The historian closed the file quickly. Even after all these years, no one liked to watch what happened next. The screams of the Shadow Warriors were said to have echoed through space long after their ships went dark. The galaxy learned something important that day. Humans weren't just capable of great violence. They were capable of something far more terrifying. Complete, methodical, patient vengeance. The historian opened the records of the final battle, the one that ended the shadow species forever. These were the files that every new member of the Galactic Council had to watch. A reminder of why some lines should never be crossed. The last shadow stronghold hung in space like a wounded animal. It was massive, built inside an asteroid at the edge of known space. The shadows had poured everything they had left into this final fortress. They had gathered their last warriors, their strongest psychics, their most powerful weapons. They thought it would be enough. They were wrong. The human fleet arrived silently, thousands of ships appearing from jump points all around the asteroid. They didn't rush in. They didn't need to. Admiral Thomas had learned that patience was the deadliest weapon of all. 3 days, he announced to the fleet. We'll give them 3 days to think about what's coming. Let them remember every child they hurt. Let them feel the fear they gave others. The shadow leaders tried everything during those 3 days. They sent out messages begging for mercy. They offered ancient technologies, secret knowledge, even their own children as hostages. The human fleet received every message in silence. Inside the fortress, the shadows felt their own fear growing. They had spent centuries studying how fear worked in other species. Now they experienced it themselves. The slow, creeping terror of knowing that death was coming and nothing could stop it. On the second day, some shadow warriors tried to escape in small ships. They didn't get far. Human vessels caught them easily, not with weapons, but with broadcasts of children's laughter turned into something terrible. The shadow ships drifted back to the fortress, their crews lost in nightmares they couldn't escape. Please, the last message from the fortress said, we surrender completely. We accept any punishment except extinction. Let our species live. Admiral Thomas sent back humanity's final response. You should have thought about that before you touched our children. The attack began at dawn on the 4th day. Human ships moved in perfect formation, surrounding the fortress in layers. They didn't fire missiles or energy weapons. Instead, they broadcast everything the shadows had ever feared. Human unity, human love, human rage. The fortress's defenses, designed to stop physical attacks, did nothing against this assault. The shadow warriors felt their own mental powers turn against them. Every fear they had ever given others came back 1,000 times stronger. The children, one shadow commander wrote in their final log. We can hear the children laughing. Why are they laughing? Why won't they stop? It took less than 6 hours. When it was over, the fortress hung silent in space, its halls filled with shadow bodies. They hadn't been killed by violence. They had died from pure terror, their minds broken by the very weapons they had created. Admiral Thomas ordered a single message carved into the asteroid's surface before the human fleet left. It was short, written in every known language. This is what happens when you hurt human children. The historian paused the recording, looking at the final casualty counts. Not a single human had died in the attack. Not a single shot had been fired. The shadows, masters of fear for so long, had been destroyed by fear itself. The Galactic Council met immediately after the battle. They passed new laws that day, ones that every species had to follow. The first law was simple: never harm the young of any species. The second was even simpler: never provoke humanity. The fortress still floats in space, untouched after all these years. No one goes near it. Sometimes passing ships say they can still hear echoes of children's laughter in their communications. No one knows if it's true. No one wants to find out. The historian finished saving his final notes. 50 years after the shadow species disappeared from the galaxy, his hands didn't shake anymore when he handled these records. Time had made the memories easier to bear, though their lessons remained as sharp as ever. Young species still came to him, asking about the empty worlds they found. Planets where shadow cities stood abandoned, their inhabitants long gone. They asked about the warning messages carved into asteroids, about the stories they heard from older races. Most of all, they asked about humans. Are they really that dangerous? A young diplomat asked him today, her eyes wide with curiosity. They seem so peaceful now. The historian smiled gently. Humans had returned to their peaceful ways after the Shadow War. They explored space, traded with other species, and shared their knowledge freely. They helped younger races, protected the weak, and kept the peace in their part of the galaxy. Many young species found it hard to believe the stories about them. But the older races remembered. They saw how other species gave human ships extra space in trading lanes. They noticed how quickly conflicts ended when human peacekeepers arrived. Most importantly, they watched how carefully everyone treated human children. Pulling a shadow had become common slang across the galaxy, meaning to make a mistake so huge it destroyed you completely. Young officers in every fleet learned about it in their training. "Don't pull a shadow" was painted on the walls of military academies on 1,000 worlds. The humans themselves rarely talked about what they had done. They didn't brag about destroying the shadows. They didn't use their victory to threaten others. They simply went about their business, exploring, trading, and living their lives. But they never forgot. Every human ship, no matter how small, carried devices that could detect shadow mental powers. Every human colony had defenses against psychological attacks. They remained ready, just in case anyone else ever tried what the shadows had done. The historian looked at his newest student, the young diplomat who had asked about humans. "Let me tell you about the day the Shadow War ended," he said. "Not about the battle. Everyone knows that story. Let me tell you what happened after." He pulled up the records from that day. The images showed human ships returning home, their crews tired but satisfied. They had protected their children. They had eliminated a threat to all young species in the galaxy. As far as they were concerned, that was enough. But the galaxy had changed. Species that had fought each other for centuries suddenly found ways to make peace. Races that had preyed on weaker civilizations quickly changed their ways. Everyone had learned an important lesson. Sometimes the quietest species were the most dangerous, once provoked. The humans didn't just destroy the shadows, the historian explained. They changed how the galaxy worked. They showed everyone that having powerful weapons wasn't enough. That being ancient wasn't enough. That any species, no matter how peaceful they seemed, could become unstoppable if you gave them the right reason. The young diplomat looked thoughtful. "Is that why everyone is so polite to humans now?" The historian nodded. Humans proved that love can be more terrifying than hate if you turn it into a weapon. The shadows never understood that. They thought fear was the strongest force in the universe. The humans showed them something stronger: the rage of a species protecting its children. He closed the records for the last time. Tomorrow, more young species would come with questions. He would tell them the same story, share the same mourning. Some lessons needed to be remembered. The galaxy had learned to live by new rules after the Shadow War. Most were complex, dealing with trade and politics and diplomacy. But the most important rule was very simple: never harm what humans love.